Hi, my name is Marlo Hood. Welcome to a new edition of the AFP Foundation's training course for journalists on climate change and sustainable development. The human pushback against global warming can be divided into two overlapping categories. Mitigation tackles the problem at its source by reducing the amount of heat-trapping greenhouse gases we have put into the atmosphere, mainly through burning fossil fuels. Adaptation, which is what we're going to look at today, is the process of adjusting to current and anticipated climate change impacts that we can no longer prevent. With just under 1 degree Celsius of average warming so far since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, disruptions to the climate system have already begun to wreak havoc from the poles to the tropics and from the depths of the oceans to Earth's highest peaks. Even if human society succeeds in its collective goal of limiting total warming to well under 2 degrees Celsius, and that's a very big if, the consequences will be enormous and difficult to manage. But try we must, we no longer have a choice. Adaptation has always been the poor stepchild in the 23-year history of the UN fight against climate change, receiving less attention and especially less money than efforts to attenuate global warming by reducing human output of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. Having said that, not much progress has been made on mitigation either. Unlike mitigation, however, we are not alone in our effort to adapt to shifting climate. Indeed, most life forms, plant or animal, on land or in the sea, are today groping for ways to cope with the changes unleashed by human ingenuity and industry. For a growing number of species, the adage, adapt or die, has become all too real. This is not a new challenge. Indeed, the story of life itself, also known as evolution, is the capacity to adjust over generations to an environment in constant flux. Humans have a particular talent for adapting to new circumstances. Aside from the North and South poles, even the most forbidding terrestrial regions of the planet have been colonized by our very young species. But most life forms don't share our agility, and many are in fact intolerant to change. An extra degree of temperature, a tiny increase in the acidity of the ocean, a slight drop or shift in rainfall, any of these may be enough to doom a species or disrupt the interlocking web of an entire ecosystem. More precisely, most species, including ours, are intolerant to rapid change. Even if the process is invisible to the human eye, distinct life forms are today disappearing at least 1,000 times faster than only a century or two ago. Such a mass extinction event has previously happened only 5 times in the last 500 million years. And no matter the cause, a sudden drop in temperature due to massive volcanic debris, or a sudden rise due to methane released from the bowels of the earth, the one thing all these species-killing moments had in common was the speed with which change occurred. Evolution has its limits. As we have seen elsewhere in this series, climate change in the last 50 years has unleashed a posse of deadly furies. Superstorms, crippling heat waves and drought, diluvial rains, displaced seasons, acidic oceans, wildfires, and rising seas engorged by melting glaciers, expanding water, and ice sheets that could, in the geological blink of an eye, lift sea levels by many meters. These climate-addled natural forces are bad news for humanity. Even a modest rise in temperature will one day cause those rising oceans to submerge cities and coastal areas currently home to hundreds of millions of people. More frequent extreme heat waves may kill hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. Displaced seasons and irregular precipitation will threaten food supplies and facilitate the spread of disease. Disappearing glaciers and drought will rob millions of drinking water. Many of the painstaking gains made over the last 5 decades in longevity, infant mortality, and poverty reduction, in other words, could be undone by climate change. The level of risk that humanity faces from these impacts depends on a number of interlocking factors, including the degree of exposure, sensitivity to the threat, and capacity to adapt. Let's take a concrete example: severe drought. Some regions in the world, the Sahel in Africa, the Mediterranean basin, and the American Southwest, for example, will be more prone to drought than others, and thus are more exposed. Their sensitivity to decreased rainfall will depend in large part on whether, for example, agriculture in each region is mostly rain-fed or irrigated, and if drinking water falls from the sky or comes from the ground. And the capacity, finally, to adapt might stem from having the resources and skills to plant alternative crops or find another source of water. Taking these elements into account, it is easy to see that a subsistence or smallholder farmer of wheat and maize in Ethiopia and the owner of a large almond plantation in California's Central Valley, even if they both face the same crippling drought conditions, will not have the same ability to adapt. One may be forced to abandon his or her small plot and flee to an overcrowded capital city in search of work to feed a family, while the other will more likely dip into reserves or take out a loan to buy water from a neighboring state or convert to a less water-intensive crop. Writ large, this example tells us an important truth. Developing countries, many of them already struggling to feed expanding populations and provide them with basic needs such as clean water, power, basic health care, and education, will be hit first and hardest by climate change and will be least able to rise to the challenge. Behind these important but somewhat theoretical concepts, in other words, lies perhaps the most important factor that will determine the ability of a family, a community, or a country to cope with climate change, and that is money. Financing for adaptation has been one of the most contentious issues in the UN-led 195-nation climate negotiations that started in 1995. In 2009, the Copenhagen Climate Summit produced a political declaration promising that $100 billion a year in climate finance would be mobilized for developing countries starting in 2020. But it provided no specifics on where the money would come from or how it would be spent. The landmark Paris Agreement of December 2015 locked that commitment into a more binding format, stipulated that the $100 billion figure would increase over time, and fleshed out a few other details. But one key point on which it remained vague was what portion would be earmarked for adaptation as opposed to mitigation. Generally speaking, rich nations have favored spending money to fix the root problem, while developing nations, pointing out that post-industrial countries were able to pollute their way to wealth with impunity, have placed a greater priority on coping with the consequences of impacts already upon us or in the climate pipeline. Going into the COP21, the 21st annual meeting of the Conference of the Parties, developing nations sought a firm commitment that at least half of international climate finance would go towards adaptation. In 2014, according to the OECD, only 16% of $62 billion was set aside for such projects. But the Paris Agreement went no further than ensuring a balance between mitigation and adaptation, a sharp disappointment to many poorer nations and the multinational NGOs that support them. While these seem like big numbers, most climate economists agree that they will soon be seen as wholly inadequate for the tasks of shoring up the defenses of vulnerable nations and helping them retool their economies to cope with climate impacts. Nicholas Stern, who pioneered the field of climate economics with the 2006 Stern Review, estimates that some 90 trillion, that's trillion with a T, dollars in global investment will be needed, particularly for megacities and to transform energy systems just over the next 15 years. Agricultural losses alone from extreme weather events have already totaled a minimum of $8 to $10 billion a year over the last decade. Currently, some 90% of weather-related losses in developing countries, by the way, are not insured. Technology transfer is also much needed. One way to defend against rising seas, for example, is to build higher levees. Think New Orleans or the Netherlands. But sometimes nature knows best. For decades, seaside communities in tropical Asia and Africa ripped up thousands of square kilometers of mangroves, shallow water forests that provided essential protection against storm surges, to set up shrimp farms and other forms of aquaculture. Today, many countries are trying to bring them back. For some countries, however, no amount of money may be sufficient to help them adapt to climate change. Small island nations, for example, face an existential threat. A sea level rise of a meter or more will literally wash some of them off the face of the earth. Highly populated low-lying coastal regions in Bangladesh and other sprawling river deltas may not be far behind. The island nation of Kiribati has already purchased land in Fiji, which has said it will welcome its Pacific Ocean neighbors should they one day become the world's first nation of climate refugees. Rich nations, of course, are not immune to climate impacts either. The kind of heat wave that killed at least 30,000 people in France during the summer of 2003 are predicted to become far more common, as are the climate-boosted storms that destroyed New Orleans in 2005 and the drought that has forced water rationing in the state of California. The United States, the European Union, Japan, and other wealthy states, of course, have a much greater capacity to build out defenses against future onslaughts from nature. Even they may find that adaptation has its limits too. To learn more about adaptation, we spoke with Pascal Canfin, a former French minister and currently the head of WWF France. What's going to make the difference or determine the difference in the level of vulnerability between, for example, a subsistence farmer in Ethiopia and, let's say, an almond farmer in the Central Valley of California?
C'est la capacité à disposer des moyens d'être résilient. L'adaptation, le dérèglement climatique, il faut le prendre comme un choc. Et selon votre capacité à être résilient, vous pouvez absorber ce choc parce que vous avez des réserves financières, parce que vous avez une assurance, parce que vous avez des stocks, etc., etc. Ou le même choc, vous n'êtes pas capable de l'absorber parce que vous avez zéro marge, parce que vous n'avez pas de police d'assurance et parce qu'une fois que vos récoltes sont perdues, elles sont perdues. Donc c'est ça qui fait la différence. C'est que le même choc peut avoir des impacts très différents selon la capacité de résilience des acteurs. Mais il ne faut pas croire que les acteurs du Nord seraient nécessairement résilients et les acteurs du Sud ne seraient pas résilients. Non, on voit au contraire parfois certaines entreprises du Nord. Vous citiez la Californie, mais la Californie est fortement impactée par la sécheresse, par exemple, pendant de longs mois. Leur richesse ne les rend pas nécessairement plus résilients. Parce que justement, ils sont sur des dynamiques, une fragilité logistique, par exemple, qui fait que lorsque sur l'ensemble de la chaîne de valeur, à un moment donné, c'est interrompu parce qu'il y a un accident climatique, on s'aperçoit que finalement, c'est un modèle qui est aussi fragile. Mais il n'empêche que, en moyenne, c'est évident que les acteurs du Sud, que ce soit les agriculteurs, que ce soit les familles, que ce soit les urbains, par rapport à un choc, par rapport à la montée des eaux, par exemple, sont beaucoup plus fragiles, beaucoup plus vulnérables. D'où l'importance, par exemple, des engagements qui ont été pris par le G7, relayés pendant la COP21, de favoriser l'accès à l'assurance. Puisque l'assurance est un des dispositifs qui permet justement d'augmenter le niveau de résilience pour une famille, pour une entreprise ou un agriculteur.
Salamul Ook, whom I'm sure you know, director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, is from Bangladesh, recently made the point to me that many developing countries, in particular Bangladesh, as he put it, are already completely in adaptation mode. That is, it's been years already that they are confronting climate change head on, knowing that they're going to be severely impacted. Is it true that developing countries perhaps are further ahead of the curve than some developed countries in terms of realizing the necessity for adaptation?
C'est évidemment leur priorité. Et ce n'est pas leur priorité aujourd'hui, c'est leur priorité depuis plusieurs années, tout simplement parce que, et c'est la très très grande injustice du dérèglement climatique, c'est que les moins responsables sont les premières victimes. Lorsque l'on regarde les évaluations du GIEC, des scientifiques du climat, on s'aperçoit que les deux zones géographiques qui sont les plus impactées et donc qui ont le plus grand besoin d'adaptation au dérèglement climatique, ce sont les pôles. Alors les pôles, il y a les ours polaires, il y a la glace, mais il y a très peu d'êtres humains. La deuxième zone, ce sont les tropiques. Et là, on a énormément de concentration humaine. Et c'est pour ça que c'est leur priorité. C'est pour ça que quelque part, ces zones-là, effectivement, sont en train de développer une compétence, un savoir-faire, mais il y a un manque de moyens criant, dramatique, d'où l'importance de la solidarité internationale et d'où l'importance d'en faire plus pour l'adaptation. Ça coûte plus cher aux bailleurs, mais encore une fois, c'est notre responsabilité de le faire.
And one last question related to the subject of loss and damage. What's the relationship between adaptation and the issue of loss and damage within the framework of the UN process?
Il y a 3 sujets dans le cadre des Nations Unies sur le climat. Il y a l'atténuation, la réduction des émissions, l'adaptation au choc climatique, et puis lorsque l'on n'a pas assez réduit les émissions, qu'on n'a pas réussi à s'adapter, il y a un dommage et il y a des pertes irrémédiables. Par exemple, il faut reconstruire des stations ou des villes qui sont sur les littoraux. Bon, on a certes essayé de les adapter, mais le choc est arrivé quand même, et donc il y a des pertes, il y a des dommages. Et la question est simple, qui prend en charge le financement de la reconstruction? Donc les pays du Sud sont assez fondés à dire aux pays du Nord, vous n'avez pas réduit suffisamment vos émissions au regard de ce que les scientifiques disent, vous n'avez pas financé suffisamment notre adaptation au regard de nos besoins, donc vous allez payer en cas de pertes et dommages, en cas d'impact concret qui se matérialise. Et inversement, les pays du Nord disent vous êtes gentils, mais on ne va pas payer 3 fois. On ne va pas payer pour réduire les émissions, on ne va pas payer pour aider à vous adapter, et en plus payer pour les pertes et dommages. Donc cette bataille-là, pour moi, c'est sans doute la grande prochaine bataille entre le Nord et le Sud, parce que les sommes potentielles sont absolument colossales. Et donc, comment établir un lien de responsabilité directe entre tel événement climatique qui a telle conséquence sur telle ville, sur telle région, et le dérèglement climatique de manière générale, et ensuite, quelle est la responsabilité des États-Unis, de tel ou tel pays européen, du Japon, dans le dérèglement climatique en général, donc quelle est la part de responsabilité qui doit venir de tel pays pour financer directement l'impact de la reconstruction dans tel autre pays. On voit bien que ça ouvre des débats complexes, mais légitimes. Légitimes parce que la réalité, malheureusement, du dérèglement climatique est en train progressivement de s'imposer.
C'est un terrain pour les avocats, ça.
C'est un terrain pour les avocats, à n'en pas douter.
So, a few tips to bear in mind on an adaptation story. First of all, it's a good story to cover for journalists. It's story-driven. When you look at case studies of adaptation, they generally involve people. And so it's story-driven in that sense. And also, they often have a positive angle to them, which is something that's fairly rare in this beat. Second tip, be on the lookout for reporting trips that you might be able to make. Contacts that you make at an event like this could later result in your being able to make a reporting trip to actually see on site how an adaptation project unfolds. There again, it's a story-driven subject, and it's something that lends itself well to a reporting trip. Number 3 in adaptation. We've said this before, but it's particularly pertinent here. Don't forget that in this story, everything is interconnected. Not everything can be laid at the feet of climate change. Concrete example, water shortages in northern India are due more to the overuse of aquifers than they are to the fact that a lot of glaciers have melted and the source of water is depleted coming down from the mountains. Similarly, half the corals in the world have died. Climate change has been a major factor, but not the only one. Pollution is also a critical culprit there. So it's a very complicated story. Don't forget, it's very rarely one cause when talking about a problem. Finally, don't forget, if you're reporting on this perpetual tug of war between rich nations and poorer ones, developing and developed, that there are legitimate arguments on both sides of the equation, usually. Developing nations, I would say in general, have the moral high ground in some sense. But for example, on the finance story, developing countries have legitimate concerns about transparency, about how money is used and how it's traced through its usage. When it comes to adaptation, there are a few key points that you should bear in mind. Number one, adaptation is an issue for most species, not just humans. It also pertains to natural ecosystems, not just human society, though one can indirectly impact the other. Number two, to assess the scope of adaptation needs, you have to take into account many factors, including exposure, sensitivity, and capacity. Depending on these factors, different societies facing similar threats will face different constraints in how they respond. Number three, in UN-led climate negotiations, financing the adaptation needs of developing countries is one of the most contentious and difficult issues on the table. The Paris Agreement only made limited progress in finding a compromise. Finally, number four, over the coming decades, the cost associated with climate change damage and with building up defenses against impacts will be measured in trillions of dollars or euros, not billions.